Robert Rosenthal is probably the most famous member of the 100th Bomb Group. His exploits became legendary among the men of the Bloody 100th, and in many ways, he was the heart and spirit of the group, an invincible role model to aspire to. He began his tour of duty on what became known as Black Week. On his first mission to Bremen on October 8, 1943, he saw 8 of their B-17s go down, including Major Gale Buck Cleven. 2 days later, thanks to his expert flying, his B-17 was the group's sole survivor of the Münster raid. 12 more planes were lost that day, including another squadron leader, Major John Bucky Egan. Rosie, as he was known, went on to fly 25 missions to complete his tour of duty with his original crew of Rosie's Riveters. And while the rest of them went home, he stayed, later stating that he had to do what he could for as long as he was able. He started his second tour as Assistant Group Operations Officer and flew as command pilot on lead planes. He was also responsible for training lead crews with Group Navigator Harry Crosby. Crosby remembered, Rosie always volunteered especially for the tough missions. He flew deep into Germany many times, and after one raid on Berlin in May of 1944, he limped his bomber back to England with 3 engines out and part of the tail sheared off by a runaway propeller. He made a hair-raising emergency landing at the first airfield they found, and right as he landed, the 4th engine died. Completely without power, the severely damaged fort had to be towed away. Rosie laid exhausted under the wing of the battered B-17. He was approached by the commander of the airfield, who looked at him, then the bomber, and said, "There's no way we're losing this war." On September 9th, 1944, as commander of the 350th Squadron and acting as command pilot, his lead fortress took a flak hit over Nuremberg. He managed to get back to American-occupied northern France before crash landing in a field. They slammed into a canal bank and toppled over. It was a particularly hard landing and all officers were badly injured. Rosie was pulled from the cockpit with a broken arm and a number of wounds to his leg and head. He was flown unconscious to a military hospital in Oxford, England. 5 weeks later, he returned to Thorpe Abbotts for duty. He didn't have the strength in his arm to fly, so he was given a desk job with wing headquarters that he hated. But he made enough fuss to be returned to the 100th as soon as he healed and was given command of his original squadron, the 418th. Rosie flew his last combat mission on February 3, 1945. He sat in the co-pilot seat as command pilot of the lead plane, piloted by Captain John Ernst. They led the entire 3rd Division, over 1,000 bombers, on yet another raid against Berlin. While on the bomb run, their plane was hit by anti-aircraft fire. An eyewitness from another plane reported it was a ground-fired rocket. Flames began shooting from one of the engines, and dense white smoke filled the cockpit. They dropped their payload on the target and radioed to the deputy lead to take over command of the division. Heading east, they knew the Soviets were closing in on the Oder River, so once they reached it, they sounded the bailout bell. At that moment, they were struck again by anti-aircraft fire, and an oil fire began consuming the center of the bomber. Rosie took over the controls from Ernst and ordered him to bail out while he held the bomber level. The autopilot was disabled, so as he made his escape, the plane began to go into a sickening dive. Alone with 2 dead crewmen in the nose, he struggled to open the forward escape hatch. The bomber was going down fast and pinned him with centrifugal force in a dizzying spin. He recalled, "I could barely move. It felt like quicksand, but somehow I managed to fight my way through the open hatch, just before the plane blew up." As he exited, it felt like he was in heaven. Away from the plane, smoke, the noise, it was quiet and peaceful. Then he hit the ground hard. He bailed at barely 2,000 feet and landed with enough force to re-break the same arm from months earlier. Hiding in a bomb crater with his .45 pistol in his left hand, he saw 3 Soviet soldiers approaching. Thinking he was a German, one came at him with the butt of his rifle, and Rosie threw up his arms and yelled, "Roosevelt, Churchill, Stalin, Lucky Strike, Coca-Cola." They immediately recognized him as an American and helped him up and hugged him. They treated his arm and passed him back through the lines to Moscow. And weeks later, he eventually made it back to Thorpe Abbotts in late March 1945. Once again, he requested to return to combat operations, but this time, the commander refused. Rosie had to quit at 52 missions, the most flown by any man in the group. We got to see some of these events in Masters of the Air, but I think Rosenthal's story deserved to be the main plot point of the show after Cleven and Egan were shot down. They flew missions with the 100th Bomb Group for 4 months. He flew with the 100th for 16 months. He was shot down twice and wounded, but always returned to service. When he started his third tour, many other flyers began volunteering for their second. They wanted to be like him. Rosie the Indomitable was the true master of the air of the 100th Bomb Group, not only because of his skill and commitment, but because he inspired the men and led by example.